The next section gets into extraction. Extraction is probably one of the most important pieces in my opinion, because this is where it makes or breaks the quality of the oil. Although the hemp itself is amazing, the extraction could damage the plant. And so here's the difference. There's a lot of different ways to extract the plant into an oil. And so some extraction, however, is highly dependent on the machine and or the people who are operating the extraction process. So just because you actually have an oil that's made from this particular machine or this CO2 process doesn't mean it's the same from brand to brand, because they may be using a different machine or a different skill set of the operator. So again, very, very delicate plant. How it's extracted into the oil is very important to understand. Is it solvent extracted? Butane, propane, ethanol. You'll hear those types of things out there. Oh, we use butane or we use ethanol. This is a highly flammable process. It requires a lot of safety and expertise. And you could actually have residual solvents, if they're, again, not doing it well or not very skilled in it, coming into your product. It also could damage the tastes and the terpenes. And so solvent is kind of, when I entered this industry about 6 or so years ago, ethanol and butane were pretty much the norms that you would move forward in and you get your oil. Today, we've moved into most of these brands are using CO2. If you hear of a brand says we use solvent-free CO2 extraction, you kind of need to question that brand, because if you just Google, is CO2 a solvent? You'll notice CO2 is a solvent. So you kind of have to question certain things of what people are saying out there in this industry. So CO2 is kind of the number one way people are extracting now. It's the most prevalent that you can hear, although ethanol, butane, propane are still being used. But there's different types of CO2, again, supercritical CO2 extraction, subcritical CO2 extraction. I'm not going to get into those details on this particular Zoom. However, you can Google those and you can watch YouTube videos and those types of things. It's relatively safe, okay? CO2 is done in a lot of different types of plants, from the lavenders of the world, et cetera, like that. The essential oils, there's a lot of CO2 extraction. But what happens in a lot of times in this particular extraction method, this delicate plant goes into this machine and it has the sustained temperature and pressure and some centrifugal force that happens to pull that oil out of the biomass product. And so that can, again, with the type of machine and the type of people, can damage the taste and the terpenes, which is one of the reasons why, if you've tried a CBD oil in the past and you can't get this taste out of the back of your mouth, or it just really doesn't taste very good, you've damaged the plant, in our opinion, in my opinion. You've damaged this beautiful plant and you're pumping out oil that doesn't taste good. So you're trying to cover it with peppermint, or you're trying to cover it with essential oils, or even fake oils or fake flavors like bubblegum or berry. Have you ever noticed that berry doesn't come in an essential oil? There's really not a berry flavor, right? So you typically have that as a synthetic ingredient. But CO2 is the most prevalent that you'll see on the market today. It is clean, it is safe, and however, it does have some challenges depending on certain extraction machines and so forth. One of the other things about CO2 too is that it's great for killing micro kind of bacteria, mold, mildew, those kinds of insects and so forth, which is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. So it's a good thing because you don't want that stuff in your products, right? Whether it's hemp or something else, you don't want anything out of your product. So this is a great way to pull it out. However, it's bad because there's a lot of people out there who are just taking pretty disgusting biomass of hemp and pulling it into CO2, because it's going to kill all the microbials and the molds and the mildews and the insects while it's in the extraction process. So again, not all products, not all plants, not all companies are taking the same high bar that you should for the highest premium oils. Now, if you're looking for just mass-produced oils, and this is a knowledge point for you, know that CO2 extraction does help in a lot of ways. But again, it does lead to bad practices for the companies that are cutting corners. And then there's a third kind of category. So there's this more the traditional solvents, and then we'll break out one solvent to CO2, and then we'll break out another one into proprietary, where people are using water and heat and different types of innovations. And those are coming from around the world, from Israel, from Canada, et cetera. There's lots of different innovations in this area, and they're becoming more of a craft extractor. They can't produce as much, the yield isn't as high, they can't produce as much oils as the CO2 and the other folks. However, the taste is typically better. There's less pressure and temperature impacts on the plant. And so you retain more of the terpenes and the natural flavors and the natural elements of the plant. So those are the three main categories that I'm putting together for this particular presentation. And you'll see those out there. When you look at a brand, they'll tout that they're CO2 extracted, or they'll tout that they have a proprietary extraction, or they'll, and so forth. So those are the main areas. But the takeaway there is, even though it's CO2, doesn't mean it's the same as the other brand CO2, because the machine or the operator may be different, right? So again, it's a category in and of itself. So in the extraction process, there are, I call it 7 steps, right? So this is just kind of my theory and my approach on this stuff, is that first you harvest the biomass. Again, you want it organically grown. You don't want all the heavy metals and the pesticides accepted. So at the farm, you're harvesting the biomass. The second step is that you're preparing that biomass for extraction. And most of the time, people are really going after those flowers, right? They're kind of pulling some of the other stuff out. And so we're typically focused again on the flower. And again, this presentation is a typical overview. There's different variations for different companies. The third step is when you start to activate the raw cannabis and turn it into the cannabinoids that we're talking about. So most people don't realize that you actually need heat for this. So the raw cannabis is sitting out there and it has these acids, THCA, CBDA, CBCA, a whole bunch of those cannabinoids we talked about earlier, those 80+ cannabinoids. They kind of start out as these acids, right? So when the heat happens, it turns them into the THCs, the CBDs of the world, which is, when you think about it, if someone is talking about getting high and smoking a joint or smoking a bowl, what do they use? They heat it, they light it, right? So it moves it over from THCA to THC. THC is the only element that will actually create that psychoactive kind of euphoric effect, right? That getting high. Now, other cannabinoids have, we're not going to that. So anyway, THC is the one thing that happens there. So this decarboxylation happens in some respect, whether it's in whatever extraction process they're talking about. They've got to move this over into those cannabinoids. Now, there is studies that say that CBDA is great for you. So that raw cannabis, that raw acid, is really good too. So I don't want to discount that it has to all move over, but there are some brands that are doing more CBDA, so they're not moving it over as far, all of it from CBDA to CBD. The next step in some extraction processes is this winterization. So after the CO2 is kind of extracted, they use ethanol and some other pieces now to move and start to remove some unwanted elements. Some people are removing waxes, some people are removing other elements of the plant. And now your oil is around, I would say, about 60% CBD, and then the rest of it is other cannabinoids, it's other pieces of the plant, again, 450 elements of this plant. So you've gone through these steps to get to this winterization step, and then it removes out some other elements that you don't really want. Step 5, 6, and 7 are now when you start to move away from all the other benefits of the plant, all the other elements of the plant. And that could be known as causing what's called the entourage effect. So this plant has a lot of benefits to it. So the more you kind of have, some theories, so the more you have in that plant, the more health benefits you're going to receive. The less you have of that plant, the more you strip out, in a sense, the less entourage effect that you're going to have. So step 5, distillation. So I'm now starting to remove more elements of this plant. So I really want a high CBD concentration. I want to put this really high CBD concentration into a vape pod and put it into my vape device, for instance. Or I really just want CBD. I don't want to focus on any of the other elements. I want to start to remove additional things out of the plant. And then we get into chromatography, in a sense, where now I'm doing additional processing that removes the THC molecules out, right? So I want to be a THC-free oil. I'm not saying that all these steps have to happen for every brand, but these are the steps, again, in an overview standpoint. Now I'm getting into 80 to 90% CBD, but I'm also removing all the THC out. You can do this step a little bit earlier in different processes, but again, this is just a flow. And then I'm getting to the isolate, CBD isolate now, step 7. So I've removed everything out. I'm now using pentene typically to come in and kind of bind itself to other elements, and then all of a sudden it just comes out with 99% CBD. So if you go from the farm to isolate, you're going through a variety of these steps, depending on your extraction, depending on your process, depending on your technology. But again, you're going through a lot of, I personally like the most robust, the least processed part, keeping the entourage effect. I want all the other pieces of the plant because I do believe it has a better benefit, but I wanted to show you that's the kind of typical flow. So now let's look at the main categories of oils. Full spectrum. Again, that's me, my theory, my belief is that the least processed with the highest entourage effect retain the most elements of the plant that is on this planet for a reason. And it also includes trace elements of THC. So full spectrum oil has a lot more pieces of the plant. It goes through less processing. So it has a stronger taste, typically, cannabis type of taste, but it also includes way more than just CBD. Broad spectrum, we talked about it going through and taking the THC molecule out. That's now here. So we went full spectrum. We now process it a little bit more. We now take the THC molecule out as other things start to come out as well in that process. And so we're impacting taste potentially sometimes here. We're impacting the terpenes sometimes here, again, depending on the technology, the people, et cetera. And then the last kind of category of these CBD products is CBD isolate. This is the most processed, like we talked about. It's only the CBD molecule. It doesn't have a taste. It doesn't have a color. It's like a white powder, basically. And so that oil will be put in oils, that would be put into gummies, that would be put into different things that people don't want to taste. So if you look at a CBD water on the shelf and it's clear, it's pretty much a CBD isolate. So you've lost a lot of the other pieces. You've lost everything from the plant except for the CBD molecule. And CBD isolate, because it's the most processed, you can start with some pretty bad biomass, right? If you're taking everything out, you're taking the pesticides, the heavy metals, and using all this technology and machinery to pull everything out, you could start with really poorly grown hemp, and all you care about is the CBD molecule. So that's another thing to think about. Not saying that every brand does that. I'm just saying that can happen based on different things that are happening in the industry. Here's a visual of that. So on the left-hand side, I mentioned CBD isolate is really just the white powder. That's just the CBD molecule, highly processed. It's clear. It's clear. You put it into a bottle. You can flavor it. You can do what you want. So if you're using a tincture and you pull it out and it's clear, it's most likely a CBD isolate, right? CBD isolate product. The CO2 extraction is the one next to it. This could be full spectrum or broad spectrum. It has a little bit lighter color. They typically will flavor it. Watch out for synthetic ingredients in the flavoring again. And sometimes, depending on the extractor, depending on the brand, depending on what's happening, they could have that bitter taste, right? It could be affected in there. The third one is the water soluble, which is quote unquote water soluble. I believe it's more water compatible. See, CBD is extra hydrophobic, so it doesn't like water. So you have to use surfactants and other things in the processing and the development of this, which is why you see some of the clumping at the top of that bottle in the visual. So you have to, a lot of times use a preservative system. This could have a very, very bad taste depending on really who is producing this product and how it's being done. There's a lot of other things that go on with this piece, and it's got some bioavailability. People will say it's 100% bioavailable. You challenge that brand and say, show me the stats, show me the research on 100% bioavailable. Typically 100% bioavailable is being done through intravenous, not going through the first pass metabolism or the body and all that kind of stuff. So those are different things in this water soluble, water compatible space. And then on the right hand side, you'll see 3 different levels of oils. Those are non-CO2 extracted oils. They contain way more parts of the plant. As you can compare it to the CO2 extracted oil and the water soluble, you can see the difference. So again, those are typically the non-CO2 or the proprietary extraction is typically going to be more craft focused than mass produced. So the big takeaway in that is that the hemp matters, and so does the extraction. And even if the extraction says one thing, doesn't mean it is actually exactly that, because the variations even in the extraction methods and technology could be different.